the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ishon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Well, Tim, we've got to open up with the weather and talk about this atmospheric river deluge that we're seeing. So here in LA, it's been raining hard, not just drizzling, just raining hard for close to 24 hours now. Already we're seeing mudslides in the canyons, houses going down. I was devastated. I turned on the TV this morning and this home, their grand piano slid down a hill, turned upside down. It was very sad. Long Beach by the coast, they're expecting to flood big time. And I live in a condo here in Pasadena in the San Gabriel Valley where we've already gotten about 3.5 inches of rain. Maybe we'll get 6 or 7 when it's all done. I don't think we get much more than that an entire year.
Well, I thought it was funny. Trevor Noah opened up the Grammy Awards last night with a statement where he said, "And we're mourning for the people of Southern California. It rained today." And I thought that was pretty funny because everywhere else sees it's raining. And, so what else is new? Here in the Sacramento area, it didn't seem to rain as much as they thought it would, but certainly the wind was pretty wild. But, I got to say, where I live in East Sacramento, I guess I am on a good grid because my power didn't go out at all. It flickered a couple of times, but it stayed on the whole time. So I just stayed inside and watched TV and left it at that. But I know Lance Izumi, our colleague, their power was out for like 8 hours yesterday. So I was a fortunate one. I had a few small branches fell down, but other than that, I'm putting on my I Survived the Storm of 2024 t-shirt this morning.
Well, as much as we'd like to talk about the weather, we ought to talk politics here. So it's the beginning of a new era in the California Senate with a new Senate leader, Mike McGuire. He's from beautiful Sonoma County, wine country, but he's got a pretty short tenure, Tim. Term limits looks like he's going to be forced out in 2026. So what are you hearing about the policy direction he's going to take? And maybe you can contrast that with outgoing Senate leader Tony Atkins, who's been an institution in the Senate.
Sure. And certainly the first woman to be both Speaker of the Assembly and Senate President. And, it's actually kind of rare that you have someone who is both the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Pro Tem. He's certainly going to hit the ground running, but hit the ground running doesn't necessarily mean he's going to put through a very leftist activist policy agenda. And it's somewhat tempered, of course, by the times we live in, right? We're in a major budget crisis. The economy is teetering on the brink. We have the major property insurance crisis. We have homelessness and housing issues. So he doesn't really have the luxury so much of being able to chart a course on the issues that are really his priorities because the issues of the day and the times that we're living in will demand otherwise. I think what you would see different with him than Atkins would have been much more willing to take a more left-wing stand for her caucus. Tony Atkins is a very good person, lovely person, to deal with in person, very friendly person. I don't know that I would have called Tony Atkins a pragmatist. And I think Mike McGuire certainly has a more moderate temperament, a more political realism, a more kind of deal-making way about him. And in that way, I think he will work well with both Speaker Rivas and with the governor. And so I don't think you're going to see a lot of, last year's budget year, I wrote that, it's a rare thing where the legislature had the upper hand in the budget fight, but they did. Typically the governor dominates. I think they will be much more kind of working together. If there are differences, they'll be ironed out behind the scenes, that sort of thing. But you're certainly going to see him put his stamp. So the people who were his loyalists are going to get the key committee chairmanships and leadership positions. Politico this morning was speculating that Senator Ana Caballero, Senator Angelique Ashby, and Senator Bill Dodd, those are going to be folks who you might see get some plum assignments and plum attention because they were key lieutenants for him in his leadership race. Although, like Senator McGuire, Senator Caballero and Senator Dodd aren't going to be here very long. Dodd is termed out at the end of the year. Caballero has 2 more years. So that's an interesting one. And to see kind of how that shakes out. But I think, you're not going to see, even though the Senate is a more liberal body, I think they're going to be much more. I think it'll be very professionally run. I don't think that it won't, even though very left wing policies will be being pushed. I don't think it will become across as, this is a left wing cabal running the show. Now, what about the issues? Now, Politico asked him about what is he going to do on the budget, because that's the key thing that's going to probably engulf most of his pro tem term. And, he said, of course, his focuses are public schools, housing, and homelessness. Well, I think that's most everybody's priorities. I don't think anybody believes that you're going to have major cuts to public education. Maybe you might have some deferrals and fund shifts and things like that. But, I don't think even a Newsom would propose that, even though the LAO has suggested there are areas where you could take from K through 12 spending. They did ask him about single payer, and he kind of demurred. He said that he is obviously a proponent, was a co-author of the Atkins bill, Senate Bill 562. And he said that, of course, we enacted the Wiener bill last year, trying to get the waiver from the federal government that he called a critical first step. And what he said is, there'll be a committee process and that every bill will get a fair shot. And he thinks the committee process has to play itself out. What he didn't tell you is that the pro tem plays a major role in how the committee process shakes out. I think they'll be a little gun shy about not holding a hearing, but certainly if the pro tem wants a bill bottled up in committee, it's going to be bottled up in committee. So there's that. Then of course insurance, which has been punted on by his predecessor, certainly Senator Atkins, and has been punted in the Assembly, and has certainly been punted by the insurance commissioner. And people are seeing the real consequences. Rates are going up a lot. People who've had insurance for a long time are seeing their policies drop. And so, we have a real crisis, and we're going to have to take action on that. I'd be hard pressed to see action in 2024. I think it'll be more a 2025 issue, because they won't, McGuire won't want to put Democratic senators on the spot for having to embrace what could be a politically unpopular deal, because certainly whatever they come up with as a solution is going to involve higher rates and maybe some real headaches for homeowners and property owners. So, but I think it's going to be interesting. But now we'll see, who are the committee chairs going to be? Who is the leadership team going to be? But, I think he starts out certainly as he'll be somewhat different from Senator Atkins. Now, Senator Atkins, certainly, you got to tip your cap to her for her longevity and for being both Speaker and Senate pro tem. And now, as she recently announced, she's running for governor in 2026. She's joining the large and ever-growing club of candidates. Now, that will certainly test, and history has shown, well, yes, in the Sacramento bubble and in her San Diego world, people know who Tony Atkins is. Does anybody outside of those two bubbles know who Tony Atkins is? We will see. Certainly on paper, you would think Tony Atkins would be just as competitive a candidate for governor as any of the other candidates who aren't exactly lighting the world on fire at this point, but we shall see. But certainly she is someone who will be long remembered for that historic role, certainly, of being first woman to be Speaker and pro tem.
So the election is starting to heat up. Super Tuesday looks like about a month away. So I got my sample ballot over the weekend. A couple of races I'm watching, of course. The one with Steve Garvey and Katie Porter for the second spot on California's Senate race. California's got a jungle primary where the two top vote getters will get to run in the general election. So right now, the new polls say that they are pretty much neck and neck. The other race that I'm following is the one being vacated by retiring former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. It's a area of Bakersfield. That's a safe Republican seat, but Assemblyman Vince Vaughn, who McCarthy is backing, looks like he's getting some challenge from the GOP. He's the establishment candidate. I think voters will be seeing races like this all over the country, where the establishment party candidate is being challenged by some more populist candidates for the Republican Party and progressives from the left of the Democrat Party.
Yes, those will certainly be two interesting ones to watch. Race I'm watching that's fascinating is the City of Sacramento mayor's race, where you have a wide open race to replace outgoing Mayor Darrell Steinberg. And Sacramento typically elects kind of more establishment, I would say center-left / centrist candidates as mayor. And you have seemingly a wide open race for two slots for the runoff in November. And you have former Councilman Steve Hansen is kind of the most centrist of the candidates running. He's running a competitive race against Assemblyman Kevin McCarty, who would probably be the liberal establishment choice. You have Senator Richard Pan, who is, kind of a center-left establishment-ish state senator who just left the Senate. And then you have Flo Kofer, who is kind of the Bernie Sanders type candidate, and she was endorsed just this morning by the Sacramento Bee. So we've had a trend in the last couple of elections of these more far-left, some might say radical candidates are getting elected to city council seats. Will that work citywide? So we'll see, who will make the top two. Will be very interesting to see how things play out in November, but lots of chess playing on the political side of things going on here in Sacramento for the next month.
So moving on to our guests this week, we've got a couple of favorites on a topic that's really bearing down on so many Californians' minds, the high cost of housing and the homelessness crisis. So PRI Senior Fellow and economist Wayne Winegarden and Free Cities Director Steve Greenhut joined forces to produce our first big study of the year on housing affordability and homelessness. Certainly addiction and mental illness are causes of homelessness, but so is housing affordability, Tim. Some families, individuals, I think, are just a heartbeat away from being homeless given the high cost of housing here in the state. When setback happens, say you lose your job, it's pretty hard to get back on your feet to make those mortgage payments or make those high rent payments and keeping the place that you live. So our new booklet addresses a lot of these issues.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion, and you kind of see the yin and yang of the perspectives each of them bring to the housing homeless discussion. So I think you'll find it a very interesting and timely discussion.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Steve Greenhut and Wayne Winegarden. So Wayne and Steve, we're very happy to have you both on to talk about your terrific new Free Cities booklet on housing and homelessness, which our interested listeners can download at pacificresearch.org/free cities. So you start your booklet with a deep dive on housing policy. In the beginning, you write about the state's reasonable housing prices in California during the time of Richard Nixon, compared with our worst in the nation lack of affordability right now. Give us a 30,000-foot view. How did California become such an unaffordable state for housing?
Oh, well, Ro, I mean, $30,000 actually is close to what the median price in San Francisco was, right around when Nixon was president. It was $28,000, which would translate into a mere $227,000 today. And that's basically not even a down payment on very much at all. The median price in San Francisco is now about $1.4 million. And basically the 70s, the whole political zeitgeist changed. Before then, with Pat Brown and Ronald Reagan, there was a real emphasis on building the California dream, building the best public school system in the nation, the best university system, the best system of freeways. I mean, that's what California was really always about, was a place where people can come, build their dreams. It was a quickly growing state, as you know. Only in recent years as the population actually declined, and it seems to be sustaining those declines. We were building the infrastructure needed to sustain a growing population where people could come and build their dreams. And I know homes in the California were maybe a little more at the coast, but it was still an affordable place to build your dreams. In the 70s, the political philosophy in the nation kind of shifted in a more environmental direction. Not saying there wasn't, some defense of some of that pushback a little bit, but it totally changed. And the state amassed a whole lot of different environmental and regulatory restrictions that made it increasingly hard to build houses. In 2015, the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office did a study about housing that said that we were at the time underbuilding about 110,000 units a year. And it pointed to 1970 as kind of the time that the problem started. So we just embraced a different philosophy, different governing philosophy about building and meeting the needs of the people who came here. And that ends up over year after year, those encrusted restrictions slowed housing supply, and we end up with prices that are far beyond what they are in the rest of the country.
If I can just build off of that, it's really basic economics that if you're going to constrain the supply, right, you're going to limit where we can build, and you're going to increase the cost of construction, and then you're going to have all these things that induce people to want to live in California. I mean, this is really Econ 101 type stuff, where constrained supply, expanding demand, prices are going to go through the roof. And that's exactly what Stephen was just describing. People want to live in Silicon Valley. They want to go to San Francisco, Hollywood beaches, climate, biotech sector. There were so many reasons for people to come to California, and we were doing everything possible to increase the cost of construction and constrain the supply. In those conditions, it's got to be that prices will just skyrocket, which is exactly what Stephen was describing.
Yeah, and just as at an anecdotal level, I knew someone who sold a house in the Silicon Valley area, and it was just a simple, very nice tract house in the typical suburban dream that in the 70s was probably just a very affordable family house, and now those houses sell for $3 million or more. So it's part of it's the demand of the area, but a lot of it is the fact that that's so difficult to build.
As you note, California's housing unaffordability problem is really a government-created problem. And you wade through several of these government-imposed barriers that make it very difficult and very expensive to build. So share with our listeners, for example, how agencies like the Coastal Commission and the former, and I know Steve hopes fully buried redevelopment agencies and other government entities have specifically contributed to the problem we face today.
Yeah, so in the book, we walk through some. We have a short section on some of these things. I think it's important to chapter and verse and not just talk generally about all the regulations, but to point out what they were and what their origins. So the big one that people always talk about, even the Democratic lawmakers pay lip service to it being a problem, is the California Environmental Quality Act, or known as CEQA, which actually my favorite president Ronald Reagan signed into law when he was governor. But anyway, and that basically it's an open invitation to a lawsuit on any project. So even projects that are widely acclaimed and don't have any real local opposition, any stakeholder, and stakeholder is one of my favorite terms. It basically means anybody. So anybody could file a lawsuit, which either could stop the project, or often it slows it down, which adds costs. So labor unions will file lawsuits against housing projects to as a bargaining chip to secure a union-only project labor agreement, or some disgruntled neighbor could file a lawsuit, and then environmental groups do also, and it seems increasingly impossible to please them on anything. And if people are against growth, they just simply file lawsuits. And I think a good example of how disruptive CEQA is whenever there's some big project that some lawmaker wants to pass, what's the first thing they do? They do a targeted exemption of CEQA for that specific project. Like when now Mayor Darrell Steinberg in Sacramento, when he was the Senate president, he wanted the Kings Arena, the basketball team. What did they do? They passed a CEQA exemption. So there needs to be reform of CEQA, but that's one of the key obstacles that pretty much everyone identifies. Then, in 1972, voters 55 to 45% vote passed Prop 20, which created the California Coastal Commission, and that gave another government agency, one whose leader for many years, and the staff remain really anti-growth. So this is another body that any sort of builders have to go through to try to get an approval, and there's a real ideological tilt to the commission. There's a new law, SB 4 423 that expands some by right streamlined approval processes for housing in the coastal zone. But up until that point, there's really been very little pushback. Voters passed Proposition 13, which I'm a big fan of because it capped property tax rates. But as a result of that, cities began to view housing development as a drain on their budget rather than something they wanted to encourage. And subsequently, the state, actually, it wasn't subsequent to that. Redevelopment agencies were formed in the 40s to combat urban blight. But subsequent to Prop 13, they became rather aggressive in trying to fiscalize land use. In other words, maximize the tax payout on every parcel. So that incentivized the construction of commercial properties, which paid 1 cent to city budgets in discretionary funds, and it de-incentivized housing. And then in more recent years, since especially the 80s and 90s, we've had inclusionary zoning, which are rules that force developers to build set numbers of below market rate houses in order to get the approval to build their projects, and that basically raised the costs for everyone. And then, thanks to a series of court decisions, localities were able to use development impact fees really to just shake down developers for all sorts of things that were unrelated to the project. The concept is that a developer should have to pay for roads and direct impacts of their housing developments, but now cities just see them as a piggyback bank. Okay, so those are some of the major state policies that have decreased the amount of development and increased the price of houses and created the problem we have today.
So we have a lot of other housing policies with well-intentioned sounding names like rent control, new urbanism, smart growth. But as you document in the booklet, they become additional burdens for home building in the States. So talk a little bit about those policies.
Yeah, rent control it basically depresses the supply of rental housing because people who are owners, landlords, aren't able to raise and adjust the rents to reflect the market, and it discourages people from entering the market, and it discourages people from upgrading their property. So rent control, as the Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck famously wrote, is basically the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city except for bombing. It just obliterates housing markets. So we've seen that. And in the cities such as Santa Monica and San Francisco that have the most aggressive rent controls, we also see the worst housing markets, just the most difficult, most expensive markets. So rent control is a big problem. In the city of Lodi, here in the San Joaquin Valley, they imposed a growth management ordinance that just strictly limited housing construction, and it turned an affordable Central Valley city into an extremely unaffordable one. So these things had a great impact on housing prices throughout the state. And urban growth boundaries are another one where in Portland, as we go into on the book, Portland is kind of the mecca for that. They created a urban growth boundary in 1973, and it essentially limited construction outside a government dictated green line, and that just bid up the prices within the green line and eliminated the ability to build new subdivisions outside of it. So that certainly harmed the housing affordability in Portland. And California, of course, has mimicked that policy in many of its cities. When you go into the Bay Area, you see beautiful empty hills right up until you get right into some of the big cities. And that's all land that is no longer developable. And that, of course, drives up the costs within the developed areas.
And what's truly amazing with all of this is that these consequences from reducing supply, if you did it in any other market, it would be very clear to people what the consequences would be. It's just for some reason when we talk about housing, people get confused. But people need access to lawyers too. I mean, that could be incredibly important. But if we put a cap on the income of all lawyers and said nobody who's practicing law in California California can make more than $50,000 a year. How many lawyers are going to stay in the state? How many people are going to go to law school knowing how little they would earn when they graduate? And so that answer doesn't change just because we're talking about rent, rather than a lawyer. If you cap rent, you're gonna end up chasing people away. No one's going to want to invest here, and no one's going to kind of expand the supply. And so it's amazing how very kind of clear-headed kind of ideas get confused once we bring it to the housing market. But what we're seeing is the consequences of it, just that fuzzy thinking.
So for so long, everyone talked about the importance of reforming these obstacles to housing construction. People on both sides of the aisle, were equally passionate about it, but we never really saw any breakthroughs in the legislature. But as you document in the booklet, there has been a real breakthrough in recent years, and we've seen some minor yet meaningful reforms that have been enacted. So tell us about some of these changes and how effective they've been in practice at clearing some of these government-created housing logjams.
Yeah, Tim, these there have been a whole lot of bills in the last 5-7 years, but mostly in maybe the last 3 years, that have tried to address the problem. So at least the progressive Democrats understand that the housing problem is to some degree caused by a lack of supply. So the bills like Senate Bill 9, Senate Bill 10 are two of the most prominent bills. 9 allows property owners to build duplexes and make up to 4 units on a property that's now zoned for single families. And that's a good thing. I think it supports property rights and encourages the development of more houses. Senate Bill 10 allows the construction of like mid-rise condos along transit routes. Now, the bills come encumbered with a whole lot of new regulations too, as a way, the legislative process and all the all the sops that the supporters had to make to unions and so forth. But it's a good move in the right direction. Unfortunately, some conservatives have opposed those things. The Huntington Beach City Council has filed a lawsuit against the state and is challenging some of those laws. But yeah, it comes out of what's known as the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard. The problem with them is that they're just targeted to multifamily houses within the existing urban footprint. So Roe mentioned earlier new urbanism and smart growth, and that's a philosophy that says that we need to densify our cities and save a lot of the land outside the cities as open space. But we can't solve the state's housing problems only by building multifamily housing. For starters, most people seem to want suburban style houses with a yard. And so I'm all for these laws because they streamline development. They provide a by right approval process, but it needs to be expanded to all types of housing development and not just multifamily housing that the new urbanists and the smart growthers support. So it's a step forward. But you mentioned the practical real world effect of it. I think it was the LA Times that did a study and found that very few new permits are being pulled. Around, I live on an acreage, and some of my neighbors I see have built second units. We've had that right for a long time, but it's very expensive to do. And especially in suburban neighborhoods, it's not that common to have a big enough lot. It's a good idea. It promotes property rights, but it's not going to solve the state's housing problems. We need to reduce regulations for all types of housing. And I'm in favor. If people want to live in dense housing, that's great. If they want to live in suburban housing, that's great. If they want to live in the country, that's great. We need choices for everyone. So we need to reduce regulations for all types of building.
So let's switch to homelessness and start with a 30,000-foot view question. There's a major debate over homelessness and whether it is a problem primarily caused by housing or whether it's caused by other factors such as mental illness or addiction. Now that you've written this terrific new booklet, dive into the question. What's your view?
I think the answer to that question is yes, right? A problem as bad as our current homelessness crisis is in California, ultimately it's going to have multiple causal factors that are driving it. Undoubtedly, there are social problems, issues of drug addiction, mental health issues. We have unrelated initiatives like Prop 47, which defines down felony so that you can steal up to $950 and still be a misdemeanor. Those types of laws make it easier for people to kind of remain on a destructive path. And so that contributes to the problem. The court case that may actually get overturned by the Supreme Court, Martin versus Boise, that ties the hands of authorities because that essentially, not to get bogged down in the details, that defined a right to sleep on the streets. And so now it's very difficult to prevent people from setting up tent cities on the streets. And that's why we see the row of tents in San Francisco, because the authorities don't have the right to remove them because of Martin versus Boise. And so all of these issues are coming together and creating the homelessness crisis, but so is housing unaffordability. The huge run up in housing costs, the shortage of supply, that is also a driver of the homelessness crisis. And it doesn't, in a lot of ways, it gets kind of interrelated. But if you have a shortage of housing, right, that drove up prices, so houses are now unaffordable. And especially when you couple that with the overall inflated cost of living here in California, now more Californians are pushed to the edge. The people are just scraping by. But, inevitably in life, events happen, sicknesses, job losses, cars break down, trees fall on houses. I mean, there's these unexpected expenses. And when you're living on kind of that financial edge, you're going to be more vulnerable to these types of adverse events. That's just going to push you over the edge eventually. You just kind of get, you fall underneath the water and just can't get your head back up above water. Where in other states, people are better positioned to kind of weather those storms. The housing affordability problems push people to the edge. And so that financial events that in other states you weather, here you can get pushed into homelessness much, much faster. And then you also have this vicious cycle that forms where as people live on the streets and the longer they live on the streets because of the hardships, well, that impacts drug addiction, that impacts mental health. And so that then begins to kind of create this really negative, vicious cycle, which perpetuates homelessness. And then you also have the extra expense of trying to address the problem. With housing so expensive, it costs so much more. So now addressing the problem is that much more difficult. So in all of those different ways, and some of them is direct, some of them are indirect, but in all of those ways, our housing affordability crisis is completely interrelated with this homelessness crisis we also have.
Yeah, we note in the book that it's a social crisis involving mental health issues, addiction issues, but it's exacerbated by the high cost because, as Wayne pointed out, it's really expensive for people on the margins to get into any sort of housing at all. It also makes it expensive for nonprofits to build housing for the homeless. And all the rules and regulations on our housing market make it hard to do those things. So the two issues are interrelated.
So when politicians typically talk about the housing side of homelessness, they're usually talking about the so-called housing first policies. And so for our listeners who may not be familiar with what that is, maybe you could share with them a little background on what exactly is housing first and why, in your view, it's amounted to an ineffective way to spend billions of dollars on anti-homelessness efforts.
Sure. Housing first, it's a theory about what's the best way to help someone who's fallen into homelessness. And the whole idea is supposed to be that from a stable home, if somebody is in a stable home, that stable home is the best platform to help them. So that if someone's homeless for economic reasons, well, then it's very clear they just need a home, and so you get them a home, and then they're able to get a job and get their life back on track, and off they go. But even for somebody who's suffering from mental illness or someone that's struggling with addiction, the housing first concept, what it says is that if we can put somebody into a home, that is a better platform from where we can then get that person the subsequent help that they need, so that from the home, they will have a better chance, a better probability of getting the help they need, addressing the addiction, addressing the mental illness, and then again, being able to get their life back on track. And so when you think about housing first, you think about Project Room Key and Project Home Key that we've been spending, hundreds of billions of dollars or tens of billions, buying up hotel rooms and trying to create kind of a home, a permanent home. And that's a key, a permanent home for those individuals. The problem with it is that particularly for someone who's suffering with mental health or addiction, that it ignores their needs, that you can't prioritize everything. And so what ends up happening is it's not housing first, it's housing only. And so people with drug addictions, it doesn't become a stable platform to help them deal with it. It becomes a place where they can shoot up. You see a lot of property damage. And then ultimately, in a majority of the cases, the people end up back on the streets, not living in the house that they were kind of given to. And then you also would then have damage. So you've just lost all sorts of resources because that house is now damaged and it was a bit of a waste. The same thing we deal with people with mental health issues. And even for somebody who's just homeless for economic reasons, it's an incredibly expensive way to address the situation. So you're spending so much money on this that you don't have the resources to A, either help more people or B, actually provide the support services that would actually help get somebody to a more sustainable position. So that cost becomes a huge kind of factor that's kind of inhibiting people's ability to kind of get to a more stable place. And then it's just very slow. Building these permanent housing, especially when that interrelates with all the things that we were just talking about, dealing with CEQA, dealing with the zoning regulations, dealing with the high union costs. It just takes years and years in order before you can actually put these units online. So what you end up having is so many people becoming homeless, not enough people getting into these housing first as these permanent homes. And so the numbers of homeless people are swelling because you're just not able to get people into these permanent homes fast enough because you just can't build them fast enough, let alone the sheer cost of it. I mean, you're talking about in LA, estimates say, and we document this in the book, that you're talking about upwards of $700,000-800,000 per unit to build affordable housing. In most states, $800,000 is where millionaires live. It's not affordable housing, but in LA, affordable housing costs $800,000, and I think that stat is just, it demonstrates just why housing first is not going to be the solution to the problem that we have.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that the initial idea of housing first was for single moms with kids who were instantly found themselves on the street, and it was saying, hey, get them housing first and then help them rebuild their lives. And then it got imposed as a statewide policy. And as Wayne pointed out, it's just not tenable when you're spending $800,000 a unit. There will always be huge waiting lists. And meanwhile, the numbers of homeless people just grow on the street. So it's kind of an ideological view of homelessness rather than a practical view of homelessness, which might entail more temporary housing and shelters and things to get people back on their feet.
So you also in your book explore this big divide between proponents of the status quo who are proposing to spend billions more on ineffective housing first programs that focus on permanent housing, and innovative groups like Dignity Moves, which focuses on temporary supportive housing. So explain the differences between the two approaches and share some examples of the promise that nonprofits and charities like Dignity Moves hold in actually making a difference in alleviating homelessness in the state.
Well, Tim and I earlier, actually it was the end of last year, we went and we visited with Dignity Moves in one of their villages. And when you go there, I mean, the first thing you feel is just the innovativeness of what they're doing, that they're nimbler, they're able to tailor what they're doing to kind of the needs of the community they're dealing with. And by the way, I should say, this is not just Dignity Moves. I mean, there's all sorts of amazing private organizations. I mean, Father Joe's Villages down in San Diego that they apply these concepts differently, right? They're looking at the problem differently and they're coming up with or trying to address a different aspect of it. But what they all have in common is that innovativeness and that ability to move quickly and much more cost effectively. And when you're dealing with a problem the size 180,000 people living on the streets, when you're dealing with a problem like that, those aspects are so important. Be able to adapt the needs of the people you're dealing with, that community, being more innovative, being more cost effective. That's the only way that we can actually really get ahead of the issue. So those private organizations are so important. When you talk about a focus on temporary housing, and that's something I've really become a believer in when you see its power, it's so important because it looks at the issue. It says, look, we can't spend $700,000-$800,000 per unit. And especially because we're not even dealing with the support that people need to address the problem. Well, Dignity Moves, right? They can build a temporary house. They're not the only ones. Other organizations do it as well. They can build temporary housing. And for $50,000, you can build a clean, private room that locks, a room that they can actually bring pets in, a room where couples can stay together. So it's a place that people will want to go to because it is a much better living environment. It has meals, it has showers, it has resources to help them begin to look for jobs, get training if that's what they need, or to get the other support if it's mental health, drug addiction. And they can do that for $50,000 a unit. So you can, $50,000 per person or $800,000 per person and not even provide the support they need. It becomes very clear that we can reach out and help significantly more people for less money by thinking about temporary housing first and using that as a launch pad to address the issue. Another huge advantage of this type of creative thinking is that the communities are flexible and can be moved. So as the problem evolves and you need supportive housing in different areas, or if you were taking advantage of a vacant area, there was actually development that was happening, but as we know from CEQA, it could take 3 years. Well, they can build a community on that site and actually get value out of the land while the developer is jumping through the hoops. And now we're actually, creating value out of land that would otherwise just be sitting around waiting. So that's, that type of kind of flexibility has a tremendous amount of value. So, and I think with that type of creative thinking, that's how we're going to sustainably resolve the homelessness crisis. We're not going to do it by continually kind of banging the housing first approach, which I talked about, spend all of this money following all the hoops, kind of, trying to build those permanent homes. And so this type of temporary housing approach coupled with the necessary support services is just providing a better pathway to address the problem.
Yeah, I just want to throw in a plug we had 3 videos, one with Wayne and Tim at Dignity Moves on the Free Cities Center website. And we went to a tiny homes community in Sacramento, which is a county, Sacramento County. It's a county-run facility that's more of a temporary approach, and also with the rescue mission in Orange County. So those are all on the Free Cities Center website.
Yeah, and I highly recommend people watch those videos if they're interested, because you really, you get to see for yourself, what these innovative programs are doing and how they operate. So, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, you get to see the picture and hear 1,000 words too, I suppose, when you watch our tours and interviews.
We can also hear from some of the people who are living there in their own words, kind of the value that these things provide as well, which was, for me, incredibly enlightening.
That's right. That's right. So as we close our discussion here on your new booklet, going forward this year and in the next few years, what should be the top priorities for local and state policymakers as we look at addressing our homeless and housing problems? Are more reforms the answer? Spending priorities, should they be different or the same? And of course, the job has become rather difficult because we have a massive state budget deficit this year. So give us your thoughts. What should policymakers be doing now to really get a handle on these two problems?
I'll jump in first, and I haven't talked this with Steve, so I'll be curious if he agrees with me or not. But I would say two things, kind of one for each side of it. When we're talking about the housing problem, and especially in light of the budgets, it's regulatory reform. Pick your regulation. Take CEQA, which may not be the right one simply because that may be so complicated to implement, but we have the ability to lower costs, to expand housing supply without spending any money, right? So that's an opportunity. We especially talking about where the budget is right now. That's an opportunity that we really shouldn't give up, right? That we can address the problem and spend no more money. In fact, we'll probably be spending less money. That's a huge win. When we talk about the homelessness issue, I think the priority number one has got to be getting people off the streets. If Martin versus Boise is overturned by the Supreme Court, that's going to be easier. It's not, how do we leverage temporary housing so that we can comply with Martin versus Boise, but still get people into these affordable temporary housing. But until we get people off of the street, the problem's going to continue to multiply. So we need to focus on kind of that aspect of it. Get people off the street into good temporary housing that's clean, that's safe, that fits their needs, and then regulatory reform. Pick the regulation that I would say is easiest to get done and get that process going.
Yeah, with the budget crisis, I mean, the problem in California, as with so many issues, isn't that we don't spend enough money. It's that we don't spend the money that we have correctly. So the state's been spending tens of billions of dollars on homelessness, and the problem hasn't subsided. So I think they need to rethink the whole philosophy. And as Wayne pointed out, move away from the housing first, permanent housing towards a temporary housing solution. And I think they'll get more bang for the buck if they do that. And I also agree, not surprisingly, that I agree with Wayne, is fix the housing issue. So these are not cost issues. These are regulatory reform issues. Address CEQA. Address some of the the building fee issues that we talked about earlier. Make it easier to build housing in general. And there's something known as the housing ladder, where there are different steps of different people at different financial stations in their life. If you fix the housing problem overall, you make it easier for everyone from the top to the bottom to get some sort of housing. And I kind of also point out the need for local solutions. We're seeing some cities, that are able to come up with better solutions, different temporary housing, tiny homes that I mentioned earlier, rather than expecting the state to be able to fix these problems, and rely more on nonprofits, which have been able to show better results than some of these government programs can do. So a lot of the solutions, in other words, are not costly solutions. I mean, the whole problem is costly, but it's more about using the money that we have wisely and embracing a more realistic, common sense approach rather than a more ideological approach that insists on building more permanent houses. What critics call the homeless industrial complex. There's a lot of money that goes to sustaining that whole system that isn't really working. So we need to focus money on things that do work. And the only good news I could say of what I've seen covering the California legislature is the only times we see hard choices made are when we have tough fiscal times, because when the times are good and they've got a ton of money, they just spend it on the same old thing. So maybe the silver lining is that the tough fiscal times will push legislators to embrace more sensible approaches.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much, Rob.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.